In this video, we're going to be explaining you in a chronological manner what events and characters made a significant impact in the 20th century around the world. Our objective is for you to know and to understand the principal and more important events that shaped this span of time, so that you can have a general idea of what happened in politics and government in this time. The events of Europe are going to be represented in blue, the ones of America in red, and the ones in Asia in green.
It was a peasant uprising which objective was to expel all foreigners from China and to eliminate the Christianity with the help of violence. But it was exterminated in 2 months, and thus China was forced to pay $303 million to Western powers. This war started because Russia wanted dominance in Korea and Manchuria, and thus Japan defeated Russia in 1905.
Porfirio Diaz was in power and wanted to be re-elected. Madero came in with the Plan de San Luis to overthrow him, resulting with him becoming president. He promised lots of things to the people but didn't complete them, making the revolution continue.
Madero wrote the Plan de San Luis. In this plan, he stated the overthrowing of Porfirio Diaz, and he made it. After achieving all of this, he was considered as the father of the Mexican Revolution.
Emiliano Zapata fought in the Mexican Revolution for the land of his people. Venustiano Carranza was a general tomb politic. He guided the North Division Army when Villa left, and during his presidency, a new constitution was created.
In 1912, China adopts Gregorian calendar because the Julian calendar did not properly reflect the actual time it takes the Earth to circle once around the Sun.
They were two military conflicts that made the Ottoman Empire back out of its remaining territory in Europe.
He was taken as a hostage and shot after being transferred.
It was caused by many factors like new imperialism, nationalism, and armed peace. The tension between countries culminated and World War I began with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. It lasted until 1918 with the creation of Treaty of Versailles.
Franz Joseph declared war on Serbia after his nephew Franz Ferdinand was killed, kickstarting World War I. Kaiser Wilhelm and the German Empire stepped into the war by supporting Austria-Hungary after the July crisis. Bernhard Heinrich was sent as an ambassador to Rome. His mission was to ensure that Italy didn't join the Triple Entente during World War I.
The French resulted victorious in a battle between the advancing Germans which had already invaded Belgium.
It was signed during the Mexican Revolution to set social rights.
Two separate revolutions which ended up with Lenin and the Bolsheviks taking power over the provisional government of Russia.
Lenin was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution. He was the one to impose communism in Russia, which resulted greatly for the people. He led several movements to achieve victory in the revolution. One was the October Revolution.
In 1920, Indian leader Gandhi launches peaceful non-cooperation movements against British rule because he wanted the independence for the Indians.
Gandhi was the leader that achieved India's independence. He led many movements, but one of his most important ones was the Quit India movement, which proposed that Britain should give India freedom.
It was signed in Berlin and had the goal to give the Americans all the right. It ended the war between Germany and US.
In 1922, the Soviet Union was created, which objective was to make USSR a powerful country.
It started in the United States and was an economic crisis which caused unemployment and made the GDP to fall in at 15%.
It was at this year when the Nazis began to pursue the Jews and made them a target of political repression. It can be said that this started the uprising of World War II.
The one to establish the People's Republic of China. He led his people on a march to keep the communist movement alive. This was known as the Long March. He also introduced people the idea that they had the right to revolt for what they wanted.
Events of the 20th century like the two world wars, the revolution of Mexico and Russia constitute a big part of the history we know today. We hope that you enjoyed watching this video as much as we enjoyed making it. The world witnessed massive changes in politics and governments during the span of time between 1936 to 1970. Many of the events that happened in this period, such as the rise of totalitarian leaders and World War II, not only affected a continent, but they had global consequences. Some of the consequences were the creation of many institutions and wars, as you will see later on in the video.
He was the President of the United States from 1933 to 1945. He was the one to lead his nation out of the Great Depression and achieve victory in World War II.
It resulted from the failed coup d'etat from the army to the government. The war was fought between the nationalists conducted by Francisco Franco against the Republicans. Francisco Franco ended up victorious.
Francisco Franco was a military general that after his victory over the Republicans, he established a totalitarian regime over Spain that lasted until his death. The period in Spanish history is known as Franquismo, a period of censorship and economic failure.
It refers to the union Hitler dreamed between Austria and Germany as a unique nation. He saw both of the countries like a single one because of their shared cultural background. Hitler made an alliance with Stalin to invade Poland and divide it. With this event, the Allied powers noticed that Hitler wasn't willing to keep his word of stop invading other countries, and that he was going to keep on breaking the stipulations of Treaty of Versailles. This culminated with the outbreak of World War II.
Adolf Hitler was the main antagonist and character of the Second World War, as a leader of Nazi Germany. He wrote a book that contained all of his plans for Germany to regain its former glory. One of his promises for the German people was Anschluss.
Stalin was the president of the Minister Council of the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1953. He was the leader of the Soviet Union during the Second World War.
Neville Chamberlain was UK's Prime Minister at the beginning of World War II. After failing to appease Hitler by allowing him to annex Sudetenland, he declares war on Germany on September 1939. He declares war after Britain had prepared for the oncoming war.
After 6 years of continuous battles and with US intervention into the war, the Allied powers were capable of invading France and began to reconquer Europe. The tide turned on Germany and war ended in 1945 with the surrounding of Germany and Japan in favor of the Allied powers.
The United Nations is an organization that has the main goal of making the world a better place.
Ho Chi Minh was one of the most important communist leaders of Vietnam. He fought for the liberation of Vietnam from the Japanese occupation and was the one to achieve Vietnam's independence.
After the victory of the Allied powers in World War II, USSR was given too much power, and this caused another big problem called the Cold War. This refers to the tension between USSR and US, mostly because of their difference in ideologies and their desire of being the best power in the world.
In February 15 of 1947, women in Mexico are given the right to vote.
The Korean War. It was a conflict between North Korea and South Korea because North Korea wanted dominance of South Korea, and thus they signed the armistice and they established the Korean Demilitarized Zone.
While this important conflict was happening in Asia, on America, Fulgencio Batista became a Cuban dictator from 1952 to 1959. Even though he established a dictatorship during his first term, Cuba made great progress by improving the educational system and investing in public works.
The artificial satellite. Soviet Union launches the first artificial satellite called Sputnik 1 into the space, and thus it marked the start of the space age and the USSR versus USA space race.
Castro was a political leader that wanted to overthrow Fulgencio Batista. He made Cuba into the first communist state and was so successful that he stayed in power until 2008, where he had to give the power to someone else due to health issues.
He became the first head of government of Singapore in 1959. He was the one that made Singapore rise like a nation with an outstanding economy.
Tibetan Uprising. In 1959, the Tibetan capital revolted against Chinese communist invaders, and thus the Dalai Lama fled and thousands of citizens died because of socialist reforms. The Berlin Wall. After World War II, Berlin was divided with a wall into East, controlled by the Soviet Union, and the West, controlled by the Allies, which objective was to prevent East Berliners and citizens of East Germany from fleeing to the West.
During his presidency, East Berlin erected the Berlin Wall. He was a liberal president in economical and domestic affairs, while having some conservative points of view with international affairs. He was the 35th president of the United States of America.
John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas by a former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald.
Vietnam War. It was a war between North Vietnam, supported by the Communist Allies, and the government of South Vietnam, supported by the anti-Communist Allies. Its objective was to reunify Vietnam into one country.
Martin Luther King is shot by a sniper while he stood in a balcony.
As you could see, in this span of time, many important events that represent the 20th century took place. Many of those events were accomplished thanks to the great and important characters who represent not only this period, but history as we know it today. Without events like World War II, the Berlin Wall, and the Cold War, and without characters like Hitler, Kennedy, and Stalin, the world wouldn't be known as it is today.